Wow, what a nice welcoming. Thank you. I can get used to that. Good morning, everybody. It's really an honor to be here in Portland and have the opportunity to share with you some of what I've been learning over the years doing this work, and also to have the opportunity to learn from y'all. There's a lot of experts in this room, and so it's really fortunate to have the occasion, thanks to Rosa's idea and the work of Natalie and Sarah, Kayla, Lee, all of the volunteers, for us all to have a chance to spend a day together talking through this and hearing from the different systems, because we all bring, as Natalie has alluded to, we all have our lens that we view this from. So in my talk this morning, I'm going to speak about the nuanced and complicated realities of young people's involvement in sex trades. What I've found in my work is that conventional depictions of domestic minor sex trafficking portray the youth involved monolithically and stereotypically. And unfortunately, this results in widespread misunderstanding about the issue. We're going to turn off the blue. Okay. Widespread misunderstanding about the issue, which then leads to ineffective or at times harmful interventions and programs. So my hope with my talk this morning is that it solidifies probably what we all already know in this room about the issue, to really hold the complexities and the diversities, so we can carry that with us throughout the day today together, but then also carry it into our work back in our communities. So to root ourselves, it's always nice to start with a little rooting. Let's look at what we do know about this group. So I'm going to use the definition provided by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000, which states that if anyone is under the age of 18 and trading sex in any capacity, they are a victim of sex trafficking. There doesn't have to be force, fraud, or coercion. There doesn't have to be movement across state lines. So clearly that's a really broad definition and captures a huge diversity of young people and experiences. And although that definition is very broad, and we know it's not limited to specific genders or races or ages, inevitably what we see nationwide is the focus is often on cisgender young women, meaning biological sex matches then their gender identity. And it's also focused on young cisgender women who are forced to sell sex. Noticeably absent from publications, from media portrayals, from documentaries, discussions, is any mention of cisgender boys, transgender youth, gender nonconforming youth, and young people who are not forced by another person. There might be situations forcing them, but there's not a third party involved. So that becomes really clear when we listen to the language people use to talk about this, and we'll hear people default a lot to she, her, the girl, as if none of these other young people are involved. But we know from research, you all know from the work that you're doing, that all genders are represented. And so I have a feeling today, even with that knowledge and awareness, even in this space, it happens at all conferences I go to and in all meetings I go to about this, some of us will continue to default to female pronouns. So when we notice ourselves doing that, this is my first ask of many in my talk, let's ask ourselves, or we know someone else doing it. We don't have to call them out. We don't have to judge ourselves when it's happening. Let's just notice and ask ourselves what happens if we broaden the conversation. What would happen if we start using he or they, or not that we're going to out anybody, but in our individual work using people's names if they don't use pronouns at all. And that way we can broaden the conversation and broaden the capacity for compassion and understanding for different lived experiences. So as much as I know we all want to be able to say how many young people are involved in selling sex, the data's just not there. There is no good data about that. And the most widely cited numbers of 100 to 300,000 young people involved, first of all, the at-risk fell off in that. So the authors, the researchers who put that number forth, it was at-risk young people. But it has taken on legs of its own and has become the truth, even though those researchers have discounted it, mainstream media, other academics. It's very, very hard to come up with a number when it's a hidden population, right? There's not a registry of all the young people who are involved in this. And we also see a similar thing about the average age of entry. So the most widely cited average age of entry is 13. That comes from a study with a very small sample size comprised only of people under the age of 18. So not to get totally research nerdy on you, but I'm just going to have my one moment, I promise. If the sample is only of people under 18, the average age of entry will never be over 18, right? So what we see really with samples of young people under 18, the average age of entry tends to be between 15 to 17. That does not mean that there are not younger youth involved, there are, but they do not represent the bulk of it. If we look at samples of adults, we see that, so 18 and above, we see that the average age of entry into trading sex is typically in the mid-20s. So what this means, and it's important, is that not all young people who start off or who are in the sex trade for whatever reason go on to trade sex as adults. Otherwise, if you had samples of adults, you would still see that very young age of entry. So some of the research from my book, and it really focused on 3 areas, San Francisco, Chicago, and New York, and then sort of broadened it to capture other urban areas, suburban, some rural areas. Show how the setting influences demographics. So this is one more little bit of research lens. So if we have a program that's working with juvenile justice involved young cisgender women, inevitably the bulk of their clients are going to be African American young women, because that's who's disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system. And so if we only listen to that one program about what this issue is, it's going to be skewed to that community. So it really calls on us to think about, okay, even though we know the community we're working very closely with, we want to talk to other agencies who are seeing different parts of the community, because the needs and the issues rising up there might be very different. So some programs do a great job of serving cisgender girls and boys. What I've been seeing is it's pretty rare for organizations that have started off just serving that population to then be able to effectively build in services for transgender and gender non-conforming youth. And in some ways it shows that one organization can't do everything. That's rare. That's very rare that every young person is going to feel comfortable going somewhere. So it's really our job as providers and activists and policymakers to figure out, how do we create spaces where all young people feel represented, so that if I have a program and it's not the best fit for somebody, I can say, hey, there's this other option in our community where you might actually feel more welcome, more seen, more supported. So initiation into commercial sex can't be understood in isolation. And what this means is we really have to look at the structural factors that precede a young person's involvement. And that requires us using frameworks that are broad enough to represent the heterogeneity of experiences among this very diverse group of young people. So that spectrum would include those instances where someone is truly forced into it against their will, as well as the structural, social, and cultural contexts that precede young people's own decisions to become involved in sex trades. So to best understand their decisions, because I know we can go down the rabbit hole of, if someone's under 18, is there really choice involved? To understand the decisions that youth make, we have to look at them in context of the opportunities and constraints in their lives. So I'll get into in a little bit why some young people are thinking that trading sex is the way to meet their needs. But we just have to expand it to say, okay, how is this happening? What are the factors influencing it? Is it somebody else, or are these structural factors, which I'll speak to in a moment, that are informing it? And then for many young people, when you speak directly to them, they'll very quickly say, this issue of choice is irrelevant, and it's more complicated than choice or no choice. So again, it's that call to hold the complexities and the difficulties and the nuances. So when we do that, when we have that broader framework, that more encompassing framework, we see that how and why young people become involved in the sex industry varies tremendously, with no one factor in and of itself really determining initiation. So in my research and that of others, and I'm sure it's, if you're doing direct service with young people here in Portland, it's what you're also hearing, is that it's often a real rarity that initiation occurs overnight and by overt force. But that's really what we hear through the media, those stories. And that doesn't mean that they don't happen. What I'm seeing in my research and some others is that typically that initiation experience of force by someone unknown to you occurs about 10% of the time. And I do have to mention, because I really enjoy, and I think the only way we do this work well is to have conversations with each other. And if something is said where it doesn't really land right with us, that we share that with the other person. So I have had survivors reach out to me and say, you know, we get sort of within the world of research that maybe it's that number, and you need to realize not all people who have experienced trafficking in the sex industry as youth show up in research settings or show up in community organizations. And so those numbers would likely be different if we had the ability to capture everybody's experience. So I do want to note that. So some of the key themes that emerged in my research about routes into the sex trade can be broken up into a couple of distinct groups. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about that. So first of all, there's the role of neglect. It could be neglect of basic needs or emotional neglect. So there are a number of young people who are housed. They have parents or guardians, and that's about it. They've got a roof over their heads. If they want food, if they want access to clothing, if there's things that they need to take care of themselves, they're on their own. And in that situation, there's very few options for meeting the needs, and so that some young people are then trading sex to get their basic needs met. For others, it's emotional neglect. So again, they're housed, perhaps all of our basic needs are met, but there's no emotional support or love that they're receiving from their family systems. And in those situations, what we're seeing is young people are forming relationships with others who are filling that need. And I'll talk a little bit later about interactions with other people and how that intersects with sex trade involvement. But when that coupling happens, it could be then that the young person's asked to sell sex to help support the couple. It might not be an abusive dynamic, or over time the relationship does become abusive and the young person is forced to sell sex. But really, the selling sex is not the issue. It's that there was this vulnerability of emotional neglect that didn't get filled in a healthy, supportive way for the young person. And then somewhat linked to that is taking on adult roles. So there are a lot of young people in our communities that perhaps have very vibrant, loving family systems, and the whole family's struggling. And so the young person is asked or chooses to take on more of an adult role to help support their family members and or help raise their siblings. We're seeing this, I think, increase a little bit in light of immigration policies that are happening. So hearing from young people and folks working with youth whose parents or guardians are here without documentation, feeling like, gosh, there's so few ways for our family to really thrive here. And young people are then taking on the responsibility to help bring money into the family, and for some of them that means that they're selling sex. We have to talk about homelessness, of course. Studies have found that young people who report histories of homelessness are more likely to report trading sex. It's sort of a no-brainer, right? If you're under the age of 18, odds are you do not have a high school degree or GED. You have limited to no legal work experience. You're out of a house, you're out of systems that maybe could help support you. There are limited ways to survive. So it's pretty common among young people who are homeless or marginally housed to turn to trading sex for survival. And then we also have to talk about homophobia and transphobia. I love that Natalie listed all of the structural inequalities, the ways in which there's system-perpetrated violence, and really calling out the need for an intersectional lens. And so with LGBTQ youth, that intersectionality becomes even more clear. So they face high rates of incarceration, family rejection, homelessness, and child welfare involvement. Each of those on their own are considered risks for becoming involved in the sex industry. You combine them all, right, and then the risks become larger. So that intersection of gender insecurity, or gender identity, housing insecurity, institutionalized homophobia and transphobia conspire to make our young LGBTQ youth more vulnerable to being involved in trading sex. So what I don't often hear in these spaces, and this might be where some people get a little uncomfortable, and I'm going to speak to that later. I have a feeling a lot of us are going to have that theme throughout the day of how do we sit with all of the varying ways we can talk about this. But in a lot of research, even within community-based organizations, oftentimes it's not spoken about how some young people are trading sex to fulfill desires. It's a desire to be seen. It's a desire to have their sexuality or gender identity affirmed. It's a desire to have access to material goods, to look like they fit in with their peer group. So there was one young cisgender man, a case manager, was sharing his experience with me and said he initially got involved just because there were some older guys on his block who were just kind of cruising him. And initially we're just like, well, we can give you nice stuff, nice things. And so we can't, I think there's a tendency among adults to dismiss the ways in which young people want to be seen and how oftentimes that's linked to physical presentation, our clothing, our hairstyle, our nails. It's super important. And so for some young people, if they're not able to present in the way that they want to, they don't have access to it, they're figuring out other ways to do it. And so all of that becomes calls to us as providers to say, what are other ways that that could be made available for a young person so that if they really don't want to be trading sex, to be able to have their nails done, to have the new cell phone, to have the new sneakers, they can get that other ways. And then we also, of course, have to talk about child abuse. I promise I will not delve too far into the research around this. I'll just sort of do the surface level of it because we could spend a whole conference talking about the intersections of child abuse with different outcomes for young people and adults alike. But what we're seeing among youth is for some, they're experiencing abuse at home. To get away from it, they run away. Then they're in that situation of homelessness, being marginally housed, have to find a way to survive. They're trading sex. For others, trading sex is a continuation of the abuse that's been perpetrated against them by their fathers, by their mothers, by their aunts, by their uncles, by other family members. And so it may be that they started off being sexually abused within the family, and then the family member is now forcing them to sell sex as a continuation of that abuse. The other theme that has come up in my work, and it's another one that can create discomfort for us when we hear it and maybe say, oh, that can't be true, and it reminds us of we have to be able to listen to young people and let them define for themselves what their experiences are, is that some young people who've experienced child abuse say that, you know, to heal and to take control back over my body, I'm selling sex because it's on my terms. Now we can talk about whether that's a healthy response to it or not, but it's the reality for some of our youth that this is the mechanism they have available to try to heal themselves from abuse that they've been experiencing. So similar to the others who spoke before me, it's very important to have the voices of people who have been involved in the sex industry as youth, no matter how they identify, right? And we'll talk about identity in a little bit. So what I've done in my speech today is just build in the voices. So I'm not someone who was involved in the sex industry as a minor. It's from Jess Richardson. She identifies as a trafficking survivor and a former sex worker, because those two things aren't always mutually exclusive. And she shared that my childhood sexual abuse paved the way for me being trafficked, but it was poverty that kept me in the sex industry long after I escaped my pimp. The misconception of childhood sexual abuse being the primary factor in leading a person into the sex industry excuses the need for quality economic opportunities. We must address poverty, which is unequivocally tied to racism, gender inequality, social and economic class, and a lack of community. So it's of course important to address the abuse that anybody is experiencing. And I think what Jess's quote really highlights is the importance of not confining the issue of young people's involvement in the sex trade just to discussions about sexual abuse. Because what that will do oftentimes is ignore the other inequalities that are creating vulnerabilities for our young people. So as I mentioned earlier, I was going to speak a little bit, and I am going to speak a little bit about third-party involvement. So again, to root us back in the definition, to be considered a sex trafficking victim as a minor in this country, there doesn't have to be someone forcing you, coercing you into doing this. Some people refer to third parties as traffickers or pimps. You'll notice when I speak, I default to third party. And the reason why is for most of us in this space, out in the general public, the second you say the term trafficker or pimp, we're going to have a very specific visual image about who that person is and what that relationship dynamic is like. And so for most people, they're going to picture an African American man who is abusive. And what I've learned from the research is it's much more complicated. I mean, that's going to be the word probably for the whole conference and all of the work that we continue to do on this is it's complicated. Of course, if I'm working directly with somebody, and they use the term pimp or trafficker, I will reflect that term back. I'm not going to impose my sort of meanings on it. But I think in these spaces, we have to be mindful of the language we use and be very clear about why we're choosing to use it to ensure that the meanings are being communicated appropriately. So let's talk about third parties. In my research and that of others, looking across all that's been published, more times than not, less than half of our young people have a third party directly involved in their selling sex. Nobody's forcing them. This is something that they're doing. We can think back on those routes into the sex trade and see where some young people are doing this of their own volition. But then when there are third parties involved, the types of relationships and who those people are vary tremendously. So particularly among our young people who are homeless or marginally housed, among our lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, queer, plus, we'll include the whole alphabet there, young people, it's oftentimes peers, friends, and acquaintances who fit the definition of what a third party is. And in not all of those cases is it an abusive, problematic relationship. So they're relying on each other as a peer network for survival. And at times that means connecting somebody to somebody who's going to pay you for sex, and you give that person a kickback, or it's giving them tips on how to do it safer, or it's driving them and providing safety. And so in many ways, what the peer group is doing is harm reduction. Like, okay, this is what we've got to do to survive. How can we stay as safe as possible while doing it? In other situations, it's intimate partners. It's boyfriends, girlfriends. Could be that the relationship started off somewhat healthy. Over time, the partner became abusive and said, you're now going to have to do this. Or it could be, hey, we've got to survive as a couple. What are our options? And as young people, there aren't so many options. And so it's figuring out from all the different types of underground economies what each person is going to do. Family members, I know from my survivor friends who it was their parents who were exploiting them. They get very frustrated in these spaces that it's very rare to have it named that it's fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, siblings who are the ones forcing people to sell sex. And in terms of that age of entry, those very young ages that we see, pre-12 years old, pre-13-year-old, oftentimes are linked to familial abuse, which makes more sense. Those are the people who have access to younger children. And in terms of the ability to leave an exploitive relationship, they're much harder to leave. And that's also understandable because there's this power hierarchy that's there. There's the familial bond. And then for some young people, it's really a formal business arrangement. So there are some youth who I've met that are very clear, like, oh, I want somebody to help find me clients. I want them to stay outside when I'm doing the date, or I want them to mark down the license plate. I'm going to pay them a certain amount for doing that, and that's the extent of our relationship. We're not intimately involved. They're not abusing me. The second I don't want them doing this, I'll drop them. So that's a dynamic as well. And we also have to name it's interchangeable. So in one moment, it can be the young person who's selling sex, and the next moment, they're the third party. So as we use those terms, pimps and traffickers, we forget that, oh, it's oftentimes young people who are playing the role of a third party. And there was a very small study done in Chicago with folks who identified as former pimps. And in that, all of the women said that they first started off by selling sex, and then they went on to being a third party. And half of the men said the same thing. And our young people will say something similar, like, oh, if I have the opportunity to get money by connecting my friend to someone who's going to pay them for sex, I'd much rather do that than have sex with that person myself. So my hope is by getting into a little of those complexities and nuances, it helps us move beyond this dichotomy of victim and villain. We realize it's just not that simple, and there's such a diversity of young people involved and such a diversity of experiences that it becomes clear if policies and programs are going to effectively meet these young people's needs, they have to examine the structural factors that socially marginalize our youth. So some youth view their involvement as a solution to issues of employment, housing, and economic needs. Some coupled with people for emotional and or sexual validation and support, and those relationships became abusive. And others are being exploited by parents and family members. This diversity of youth and experiences means the solution is not as simple as focusing on efforts of rescuing our young people and punishing the bad people. Attention needs to be directed at the root factors that contribute to young people either deciding that sex trades are their best or least worst option, or finding themselves in a situation where they're forced or coerced to engage in these activities. Our young people need social and economic power, access to safe and stable housing, and the ability to have their choices about living situations, service needs, and sexuality respected. So I'm again going to build in a quote. This is from my colleague, Min Dang. She and I are leading the task force evaluation in San Francisco, and she identifies as a scholar, survivor, and activist. So when I interviewed her for my book, she shared, so I think around child sex trafficking, if we really focus on building healthy emotional children, and what's needed for that, all the systems needed to make that happen. If we address that, then my 11-year-old niece or nephew, if shit hit the fan for them, they're not going to think, I need to go sell myself. They're going to think, I have these adults who are in my corner, and they'll help me figure it out. And they're not living in a neighborhood where they have violence walking down the street. They're not going to a school where they're hated because they're black. They're in a micro, meso, macro space that facilitates their holistic development. So when we listen to young people, we quickly realize that the language we use in spaces like this, or perhaps we use with our colleagues, is not language that really resonates with them. There are few young people who I've met who really initially resonate with the language of trafficking or even commercial sexual exploitation. Over time that may shift, but at that first point of entry, that language will not connect. We also learned that for many, their involvements in trading sex is not at the top of their list of priorities of stuff they initially want to work on or immediately want to work on. So for those of us doing direct service work, advocacy, or research, it means we have to be able to refrain from applying our systems of meaning and understandings to a young person's experience. Our aim instead should be to create spaces where one truth is not better than another. The moment young people feel like their truth isn't heard or validated, they disengage. So unless a young person's mandated to your services, they vote with their feet. If they stop showing up, in general, there's a reason. So we also want to create spaces where the truths are allowed to change. All of us in this room have experiences of talking about something that happened in our lives, defining it one way, years later having a completely different meaning that we ascribe to it. And so for young people who are trading sex, the way they make sense of it when they're 15 may vary to what they do at 17, or it might even vary day to day. One moment it could be, this is great, it's what I want to do. The next moment, this sucks, it's awful, and it oscillates. And we just get to roll with that and hold space for them and validate their truths in the moment. So later this afternoon, I get the wonderful opportunity to do a breakout session about legal responses to this issue. And normally in a talk like this, I would spend a lot more time delving into the legal stuff, but knowing I get that opportunity, and some of you will likely come to that session, I don't want to repeat. So I'll be brief here. And in that presentation, because I know our law enforcement partners often feel isolated or pointed out, overly criticized, the presentation will be looking at some successful cross-system collaborations with law enforcement and service providers. So it's holding the reality of it. So what I will say though about legal responses is overwhelming anti-trafficking efforts have largely prioritized law enforcement responses. And although law enforcement responses are needed and a necessary component of anti-trafficking efforts, laws alone are not sufficient to prevent our young people from trading sex, and we can't legislate our way out of this issue. So to be in compliance with the TVPA, no one under the age of 18 should be arrested for selling sex. Many states now throughout the US have decriminalized prostitution for minors for that very reason. And that they're also, to be in accordance with the TVPA, aren't supposed to be housed in correctional facilities. They're considered crime victims. And so if we're needing to find housing or supportive placements for our young people, the TVPA is very clear that correctional settings are not that. Framing trafficking as a crime versus a human rights violation, I believe, makes it a criminal justice response, where people justify arresting youth for the sake of services. Looking at the research, little evidence is out there that supports that arresting someone to connect them to services results in positive outcomes for that young people. In fact, in some cases, we hear from young people that when mandated to services, they feel like the programs perpetuate some of the same power dynamics that they were experiencing when they were in an exploitive situation. A direct service provider who, when I spoke with her, was based in Denver, explained it to me this way. When mandated to services, people are getting A, B, and C, usually shelter, food, and a certain amount of love. They have to give A, B, and C to get that. So they have to be that good client, in by 10 or whatever the curfew is, and work all the different groups and programs they're told to do. That can be very similar to the same things they are getting in an exploitive situation, which is shelter, food, and conditional love. And the same things they have to do, which is be loyal, be back to their exploiter by a certain time at night, and make money. Those power dynamics to many of these young people feel the same. Now from a social work perspective, so my background is in social welfare, targeting people for arrest in order to offer services is considered coercion. Services should not be conditional on arrest. We want them available to all young people. It makes no sense to only have services available if you've been funneled through the juvenile justice system. On top of that, arresting people for services violates standards of informed consent and rights to full participation that all of our direct service organizations have. So to wrap that portion up, the ending point is, arresting people oftentimes, more times than not, exacerbates the problems they're already experiencing, and definitely then limits the opportunity to have other life course options available. It's much harder to break that cycle of incarceration and arrest once it's already started. I've been doing this work long enough to know that at some point during the day-to-day, most of us are going to feel uncomfortable. And I would imagine there's things in my talk that have already made some people feel uncomfortable in this room. It happens every time. And it's to be expected. It truly is. It was even mentioned in a guide that the Office for Victims of Crimes put out for groups who are doing anti-trafficking task forces. And in that guide, what they said was, conflict will arise among agencies and organizations, as well as among individuals. It is a predictable interpersonal human dynamic and organizational reality. So at the conference today, we have folks representing various systems. We have government officials, we have law enforcement representatives, service providers, member of faith communities and organizations, many more folks that I'm probably not even aware of because I'm new to the space and I don't know everybody yet. We also likely have people who have experienced trafficking in the sex industry, people who identify as sex workers, and people who perhaps don't even put labels to their experience, but just say, I do what I have to do to survive. So we should never assume, even if people are not out about their experiences in this space, that there are not people here who have had experiences trading sex as young people or as adults. Inevitably, like the e-guide named, there are going to be tensions because of the diversity of who we are in this room and the differing values, beliefs, and perspectives and priorities that we bring. So when you catch yourself feeling triggered or uncomfortable or at dis-ease, or you feel like a certain perspective is being excluded, note that. In that same moment, someone else is probably shaking their head and saying, finally someone's saying what I've been waiting to hear forever. Or if you find yourself nodding in agreement with what someone's saying, you can be sure that someone else is probably feeling alienated by it. Our task, though, is to think critically about our limitations, strengths, and the challenges of collaborative work that involves so many differing perspectives and approaches. It's only by engaging in this multi-sector work that has moments or very long stretches of time that are tense and difficult that we have the potential to create meaningful change. The goal is to include as many groups and perspectives as possible in the conversation so that we can ensure effective political, cultural, and economic changes. The diversity of perspectives is what will help lead us to changes that hopefully don't bring as many collateral consequences that harm the very people that we're trying to support, as we've seen with some anti-trafficking initiatives that have already occurred. So as we move through our day together and hear from the various presenters, I ask you to keep in mind the diversity of young people involved, the varying dynamics of their involvement, and the ways in which we can build better systems to support our young people. So no matter the system we're connected to, be it a researcher, an activist, a social service provider, policy maker, oh, I thought maybe I was getting the 5-minute Oscar. You gotta wrap it up. But I am down to 3 minutes, so it's perfect timing. No matter what sector we're working in, we can all be doing a better job. We really can. And we have to open ourselves up to critical feedback from our colleagues and not take it personally. Take it as, oh, this is how we get better. This is how we hear what's not working. This is how we can make changes to better serve our young people. And those conversations hopefully will lead us to how can we create more housing options for youth? How can we connect them with viable employment options? How are our immigration policies putting our young people at risk? How can we better address intergenerational trauma and abuse? And how can we ensure that our young people have access to supportive and non-judgmental holistic health care? How do we celebrate and support our youth of all ages, genders, and sexualities? So I look forward to learning from all of you today, the ways in which you're doing that, how you think we could be doing it better, what's not working, and thank you very much.